Now the interesting thing here is that if, or the onCreate, this onCreate method, which we're going to do now, is only run when the database file did not exist and was just created. So if the constructor runs and it creates the database name with a specific database version, it's going to run the onCreate to start building your whole database with its tables and its columns and everything, which we're going to do now. So the onCreate is only run when the database file did not exist and was just created. If the onCreate returns successfully, which means it doesn't throw an exception, the database is assumed to be created with the requested version number that you specified. This onUpgrade method is only called when the database file exists, but the stored version number is lower than requested in the constructor. Okay, so let's just go quickly. I'm going to go through that again, what I just said. So let's go to creating the database inside of our onCreate. And then when we're done with that part, as well as done with the onUpgrade, I'll just go through it again to make sure that you understand. So the first one there, what we want to do is to basically do the following thing. I'm just going to add a comment there. Just to get the simple Java part correct. So what we want to go and do is to create a new table in our database. So we're going to say create table, and we're going to have that contacts table in SQL now, and then the table will be the ID. First column will be ID, and that column will be an integer. It will also be the primary key, and it should also auto increment. Okay, so that's basically the code that we want to place. The second argument, just going to go to a new line. The second, I'm sorry, not the second argument, the second column, that's the first column. The column, remember, we're creating a table called contacts table. The first column will be called ID. It will be an integer, it will be the primary key, and it will auto increment. And then the second one, or the second column that we're going to use, is that person name of ours. That's the second column, and that will be text, and it will be not null, so it cannot contain null values. Then we're going to say a comma again, and then the next one will be underscore cell, the cell number column, and then we're going to also say text not null, and then we're going to close it off and end it off. So this is the SQL query basically, or the SQL statement in order to create our database for us. So we're going to create a new table in this database name for this version called contacts table, with the first column being ID. It's going to be integer, primary key, auto increment. The second column person name, text not null. The third column cell, text not null, and you can keep on adding columns here now. So that's the text that we want to have. But in Java it works a bit different, so we just need to go and do this the correct way. So we need to go and have a string that we're going to declare. So I'm going to say string SQL code equals, and now I'm going to try to recreate what we did here but in Java coding. So we're going to say create table, and then a space, and then we're going to use our database table as we declared it at the top, which will basically be contacts table. So we're going to create that table. Then after contacts table there must be a space and then the bracket. So we're going to have a space and then the bracket. Okay, let me just go to a new line there. And then after that we need to have the first column name, which is underscore ID, but we called underscore ID key row ID. So I'm going to say key row ID. Okay, and then a space again, and then integer primary key auto increment. So it's going to be integer primary key auto increment. Okay, hope you're okay with that one. And then we need to place a comma there, which is still fine. We can place a comma and then a space, and then again the next column name. So I'm going to go to a new line. The next column name will be key name. Again, a space, and then we're going to have text not null. So it's going to be text not null. Then a comma, you can see the comma there, comma, and then the next column name. A space, and column, a space, and then the next column name. So there's the comma and the space, and then the next column name will be key cell, and that one will also be text not null. So you can see there after cell there's a space and then text not null. So there's the space, text not null, and then we end it off with a bracket that closes and the semicolon that closes. So that's very important. And then our Java code should also close with a semicolon. So just make sure that you're okay with this part. Remember, that's what we want to accomplish, and we did it in coding like this. And then just to execute the query, remember that in the onCreate there's a database, an SQL database that will be passed through. So we're just going to say their DB, that specific one, dot execute SQL code for me. Which SQL code? Well, this one that we created there. So it's going to execute this one. As soon as it executes this SQL code, we're going to create this new table with the name database table, with these columns, and with those properties for each column. So that's the onCreate. So just remember that the onCreate only runs when the database gets created the very first time. So by using this DB helper class, we're creating a database with this name and the version, and then the onCreate will directly run. OnUpgrade will not run unless you change the database version. If I run this and I go and change the database version to a 2, it's going to go directly to OnUpgrade, and then we're going to do something in OnUpgrade. Okay, so basically in the OnUpgrade method, we're going to do the following. We're just going to say, you can also see there's a database that's passed through. So we're going to say that database dot execute SQL, and we're going to do the following. We're just going to say drop the table if it exists, and then indicate the table name. So it's going to be database table. Okay, so basically when we upgrade the database, when we change the database version, we can drop the table totally and then create a new table. So how do we create a new table? We just call the onCreate method again. And then remember, this onCreate accepts a database, so we're going to pass in that DB again. So basically when onUpgrade runs, we're going to drop the table, delete the whole table, and then call onCreate again to recreate the table for us. That's if you change the database version. So obviously if you want to save the previous data of your table, when onUpgrade runs, you need to do that before you drop this table. Okay, so that's just the job of the onUpgrade method. And next we need to do some really important methods. So after this DB helper class of ours, I'm just going to click on that bracket to see where it ends. After that class, we're going to create some very important methods. So the first method that we need to create is the open method. So we're going to say contacts DB and then open, and this method will be throwing an SQL exception. And then inside of this method, we're going to declare, or we're just going to initialize our helper that we declared there at the top. So you can see we've got DB helper, our context, and our database. Okay, so let's go down to the bottom again. So in this open method, this method will help us to open up the database so that we can start reading or writing, reading from it, writing to it. So this open method, we're going to say our helper that we declared at the top will be a new instance of this inner class. So we're going to say new DB helper, and we're going to say our context. So now remember, when we pass in this, it's going to go to this constructor, passing in the context, which is our context. It will go to the database name and the database version, as if your database version actually differs from the one that's currently saved on the phone, it's going to run on upgrade. Okay, if the database does not exist at all, it's going to run on create. But if the database exists and the database version did not change, everything will just stay the same. We're just basically opening it up. Okay, so then our helper equals new DB helper, our context. Then we're going to say our database, which we declared at the top. We said our database, which is an SQL database, equals our helper dot get writable database, so that we can actually start writing or reading from the database. And then we're just going to say return this. Okay, so then the next method will be the close method. So we're just going to say public void close. And in this close method, we're just going to say our helper dot close. So that will just be closing the database. So we're going to call open to open up the database, close to close the database. Okay, so then the next methods is the methods that will help us to basically create a new entry, retrieve the data that's currently in the database, delete the data, and updating the data. So these methods you can actually go and create and name whatever you want. So I'm just going to create 4 methods to quickly explain those specific instances that we could possibly get. So I'm going to start with the create entry one. So I'm going to return a long value, and I'm going to explain that now. And we're going to say create entry. Now remember, you can name this method anything you like. So for our create entry, we need to have a name for the guy, and remember, we need to have a cell phone number. Okay, we have 3 columns. The first column is just an ID, but remember we said that that ID will auto increment. So you'll see in the database will automatically give us a value for that one. So the first guy you enter to the database will start with 1, and then it's going to auto increment for every next one or every other person that you add to the database. And then we've got a name and a cell phone column. So we're asking for the name and the cell phone, and then we can basically add a new entry to the database using that name and cell phone. So what we need to do is to go to a class that is called content values. So this content values class will help us with key value pairs so that we can add those key value pairs to the database. So we're going to say CV, or whatever you want to call it, equals new content values with nothing in brackets. And then we're going to say CV, that content values, dot put. So there's a put method, and this put method takes a key and a value. So the key, again, is just a specific name for the data that you want to save. In this case, we want to use the column name. So the column name, in this case, will be key name. That's the name of the column, key name. And then the second argument will actually be the value that you want to save in that column. And the value that I want to save is name. Okay, and then we're going to also say cv.put. Again, the first argument, basically your key. So in this case, it will be our column name again. So our column will be key cell. And then the second argument will be the cell phone number that we want to save there. So you can basically see I'm indicating the column name and then the value I want to save in that column. Remember, we are creating a new row. So it's like this Excel spreadsheet. We'll be creating this new row. This ID column will be auto incremented every time. So we're adding the person, the Jack Porter in the person name, and the cell phone number in the cell phone column. Okay, so we're passing in Jack Porter and the cell phone number, and so in the person name column we're going to save the name, and in the cell phone column we're going to save the cell phone. Okay, and then when you're done, we need to return. So we're going to say return our database dot insert, and the insert method will actually insert data to your database. So we're going to say insert to the database table, second argument null, third argument whatever you want to place in there. So we're going to pass in the CV, which is the content values that holds these two values for the specific columns. So I think this one is quite easy. Now the insert method returns the number of values that you've inserted to the database. So you can see then that's why we have the long there. We could also insert a lot of values, so that's why we use a long there instead of an int. But in this case, for our create entry method, we'll actually only insert one. Okay, but this is just an example of how you could do a create entry. So this one actually only adds one entry to the database. Okay, so the second one, that's create entry then. The second one will be to get the data back from the user or back from the database. Okay, so for this one, we're going to say public, and remember you can name this method also just what you like. So I'm going to say public string get data, and I'm going to return a string, but if you want to return an array list with data or whatever you want, you can also do that. So I'm just going to return a normal string, and let me just say return null at this stage so that we don't have that error. Okay, so what we want to do, the first thing when you try to retrieve data from your database, you need to indicate which columns do you want to retrieve. So I'm going to choose the columns in an array. So you need to use an array. So I'm going to say columns equals a new string array. And then we're going to initialize that array with the column names. So the column names that I want is the row ID. I'm going to show the ID. And then the second one is the name. And then the third one will be the cell phone number. So I'm just indicating which of the columns do I want to return in this specific getData method. So in this case, I'm returning the values in every one of the columns. So this columns array indicates which of the columns do you want to retrieve. So in this case, I want to retrieve all three of the columns or the values in all three of the columns. Okay, so the next thing is we need to go and create a cursor object in order to move the cursor. So basically what we want to do is to go and set the cursor at a specific position and start reading at that position. Okay, so we're going to set up a cursor object. So it's going to be cursor, whatever you want to call it, equals our database dot query. And then we're going to need to add or to indicate the database table name. So that's just database table. The second argument is the columns that you want to use, and the columns will be this string array that we're going to use. And then for all the rest, you can see there's a lot of selection arguments, group by, having, order by. So you can set values for all of those, but for this example, I'm just going to set null there. I think there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of them. Okay, so that's just creating a new cursor inside of this table with selecting these columns. So then the cursor object has been created, and now we can start retrieving the data. So I'm going to say string result equals, and then we're going to start off the result. Now, before we go to the for loop that will run us through the data, we need to go and get the index for every row. So if I, sorry, not for every row, for every column. So if I go to the columns, you'll see that this column is at a specific index. So it could be a 0 or a 1. And then the next one, let's say this one is at index 1, then this one will be at index 2, and that one will be at index 3. So you need to get that specific index in order to retrieve the data. So in order to do that, we're going to say int I row. So the index for the row ID, it's a row ID. The index for the row ID column, so that will be the first column basically. Okay, in order to get that, we're going to say that cursor that's now got a connection to our database table, and it got a connection to those columns. And then we're going to say dot get column index. So you're going to say get column index, and then indicate the name of the column that you want to get the index of. and that's key row ID. So I'm now getting the index, and remember that could be a 1 or a 2 or whatever the index for that specific column. I get the index for the column, and now I need to get the index for all of these in order to retrieve the values in those columns. So I'm going to say int I, now the next one will be the name column, equals c.get column index, again key, in this case name, and then I'm going to say int I, other column is called cell, and then I'm going to say c.get column index, and I want to get the index for the cell column. So now that I've got the index, I know where that specific column is, I know the index of the columns, we can now start extracting the data. So to extract the data, we need a normal for loop. Now a for loop has got basically three values that we need to set. So the first one is the initialization, the second one is the test, and the third one is the increment. So I'm sure you're going to understand this for loop quite easily. So the first one will be c dot, so we're going to take the cursor and we're going to move the cursor to the very first item. So that's just initializing it, starting right at the top. So we're moving the cursor to be at the very first one, move to first. So that would be the cursor. Cursor will be pointing to this one then. Okay, and then the second argument is normally the test part. So we're going to say c dot is after last, but we're going to put a not there. So this for loop must run while the cursor is not after the last one. So remember, after the last one would be at a row where there's no data anymore, and then we want to stop. Okay, so cursor dot is after last then, and then the last one is to increment it. So we're just going to say c dot move to next, and that's incrementing the for loop. Okay, so let's see what we're going to do then inside of this. Now remember, we've set up result there, so I'm going to say result equals that result again, or the previous value of result, plus, and now the cursor is at a specific row. Every time the for loop runs, the cursor is at a specific row. Okay, so what do we need to do? We need to say c.getString, and then I need to indicate the index. You can see there, it gives us a hint there, the column index. So the column index that we want to return is called I row ID for the very first one. So I'm going to retrieve the string value inside of that row ID column. Remember, the cursor is at that specific row, but I'm retrieving using the get string method, I'm retrieving that specific column's value, which it will be the 1. Okay, that's the row ID, and then I'm going to add, let's just add a colon there, and then we're going to say c.getString again. But this time we want to get the name of the guy. So I'm going to say I name there. So now it's going to go, it's still standing still at that specific position, but now it's going to retrieve the name of that guy. Okay, and then after the name, we can go and say, well, please give us the cell phone number as well. So let's just put a space there. And then we're going to say, I'm just going to go to a new line. Then we're going to say c.getString I cell, which will get the cell phone number of the guy. And then we can just add a new line character there so that we can keep on adding all of the values inside of the database. Okay, so that's basically it for this method. Last thing that we need to do, if we're done using the cursor, we just need to close it so it frees up the memory for the cursor. It doesn't exist in memory anymore, and then we can just return the result. So this getData method will then return the result, and remember, you could have had a class created with an array list where you create an instance of the class, place it in an array list, and at the end you return the array list. This is just a simple example where we are returning basically a string value.